of PyCon Australia get started. Next up on stage, we have Graham Dumpleton. He is the original author of Mod Whiskey or Mod WSGI, whatever you prefer. He is also working on OpenShift at Red Hat and does a lot of Docker and just enjoys this whole deployment process, apparently. Give him a round of applause.
Helps if I turn the mic on. Okay, as Marcus said, I'm the author of Mod Whiskey, so if you do know who I am, that's where you probably would have heard of me. I also have another Python package I write called Wrapped for doing evil monkey patching stuff. And I used to work at New Relic, where that was used to do horrible things to your production code, which you have no idea about. So if you're using New Relic, be scared if you actually looked at what happens inside. So let's get on with this. So Whiskey, what is it? Where does it fit within the ecosystem of things? So you want to deploy a web application using Python. And so in order to do that, you're going to have HTTP client requests come in from a browser, from a person in the real world. That's going to come into a web server. Now, when that request comes in, it could be a request for a static resource, a static file, your style sheets, images, and so on. Or it could be the request that you want to handle in your web application, the thing that is going to dynamically generate a response for you. And you're going to implement that in Python. So Whiskey is the bridge between the HTTP request coming in and your Python web application. Okay? It's the thing that sits in there in the middle. Very important though, and this is a bit of confusion out there from some people, WSGI is a specification for an application programming interface. It is not a wire protocol. Some people confuse WSGI with FastCGI or SCGI, which are essentially, or even HTTP itself, which are a description of how information is packaged together when it's sent across a socket connection. WSGI is not that. It is an application programming interface. WSGI is also not an implementation of anything. It is a spec only. People will say, oh, I'm running my Python web application on WSGI. Okay, good. Which server are you using? Okay, it is a specification. This is the only code I'm going to show for what a WSGI app is. So this is sort of the hello world, the canonical hello world for a WSGI application. And this just shows you how it's just a programming application interface, or defining how something can bridge into Python. And it's very simple. You apply a application object or a callable object in Python. In this case, I'm using a function. It is going to be called by the bridge, the WSGI bridge. And it's going to give it an environment dictionary which has details of the request and a start response method. The job of the web application then is to provide a response. Now, it's going to provide back a status of whether the request is successful or not, some headers, and some content. And that's basically all it is to it. But friends, don't let friends use raw WSGI. Is there anyone here writing raw WSGI apps? Oh, good. I don't see any hands. What you should be doing if you're writing a web app is using a framework. And the reason you want to use a framework is that mucking around down at the low level of raw WSGI is hard, it's complicated, there's lots of corner cases where things can go wrong. You trust people like Marcus here, who works on Django, or people like Armin Ronischer, who did Flask. You trust these people. They've gone and worked out all of the hard, horrible details of working with WSGI and packaged it up in these frameworks. Now, some people will also say that friends don't let friends use web to Py, but I have listed it down there. So you have a web application. You've written it on top of a web framework, but you still need a way to host it. Django provides a development server. Flask provides a development server. They are development servers. They are not good enough for production. There's lots of reasons for that. So you still need a production-grade WSGI server if you're going to actually run this thing up for real and let people hit it with real web traffic. And this is where Mod WSGI comes in. So Mod WSGI is a module for the Apache web server. The Apache web server is written in C code. So ModWSGI is actually a whole bunch of C code. There is no Python code in it. It's C code which uses the Python C API, and it's compiled into an object file, which is going to be loaded into Apache at runtime. Traditionally, people have seen configuring and setting up Apache and ModWSGI as being hard. Okay? People get stumbled across the idea of how to configure Apache itself, but then also how to set up ModWSGI. And part of that was also the installation itself. You know, you can install ModWSGI from an operating system package as a binary, or you can take source code and use a make script to go configure, make, install. But there's a much simpler way, and this is what a lot of people don't know. You can just go pip install ModWSGI. All you need to have on your box is your Apache runtime and development packages, and you can do that. If I take my canonical hello WSGI program and just shove it in a hello.wsgi file, I can then go ModWSGI express start server and give it the name of that file. It will run up an instance of Apache for me, and your application will run. Importantly, you didn't configure anything. ModWSGI express will do that for you. That start server command will go and generate for you on the fly a configuration for Apache and do it all for you. And most importantly, it'll use all of the options which I believe are best practice. When you take a standard Apache distribution, it's generally set up for static files and PHP apps. And then you still have to configure ModWSGI on top of that. And just because of the history of how software often works, you implement something a certain way first, and you come up with a better idea later. But you can't change it to use the better way, because there's all these people relying on the old way already. So the defaults in ModWSGI are also not the best you can use, and you do need to configure it. ModWSGI Express, because it's now come along, ModWSGI is 10 years old. ModWSGI Express is about 3 years old now, I think, from memory. I've 7 years of knowledge of how to do these things properly. It embodies all that good config knowledge that has been developed. What if you're using Django, though? Well, we've made it easy for Django as well. When you pip install ModWSGI, it's building an Apache module. It's installing this ModWSGI Express script, but it's also installing, amongst other things, a Python module which you can use with Django. Essentially, it's defining some Django management commands. I can, in the installed apps for Django, just list it. And just so we get some nice logging out, because Django doesn't do this by default, we tell Django also to put logging information to standard output. Once I've done that, I can then go and run the management command, python manage.py run ModWSGI, and it will run it up. Very importantly is that it also automatically sets up Apache when it does this to host your static files. So in Django, if you've set up static URL and static root, and you've done python manage.py collect static, which to generate all the static files and bring them into one spot, and you run this command, it will automatically host up all your static files for you as well. You didn't even need to do that. Now, that looks a lot simpler, but Django Development Server gave me this really nice ability to automatically reload code. So when I'm doing code development, I'll get all my new changes in. You can do that with ModWSGI Express too. I can just provide -minus reload on changes. Now these options I start to show here, even if I'm showing them in context of the management command in Django, they still apply if you're running ModWSGI Express start server with a separate WSGI app. It's not Django specific, okay? So I can do that, touch the code, and it will automatically reload. Just to make that, oh, the next thing is, for development again, is ModWSGI Express also provides some other nice features for doing development. So I can put this in my Django settings file, and I can, if the ModWSGI Express debug mode is on, I can turn on debug mode in Django. If the debugger is enabled in ModWSGI Express, I can tell it to propagate exceptions up. Now, what do I mean here by debugger? Well, I can do this. I can run that and say ---- enable debugger. If I now have an exception in one of my request handlers in Django, it'll propagate up, be caught, and immediately fire you into a Python debugger, PDB, and you can debug it if need be. There's other things in there for coverage analysis, logging an audit trail of requests, what the request contents was, the headers, response content and headers. There's options for enabling things like that as well, and profiling and so on. So there's all these nice features in there as well to help allow ModWSGI Express help you doing development as well. So you get away from the mindset that Apache is not just production. It can be used in development using ModWSGI Express as well. But what about production? Do we still have to go back and configure Apache manually? And the answer is no. I can run my same command and put at the end of it -- setup only. And what it'll do is it won't actually start the server up, it'll just generate configuration. Now in this case, I'm going to want to run this on port 80. So I'm going to tell it I want to run it on port 80. By default, ModWSGI Express sticks things in temp. So I'm going to instead say, put all the configuration in a certain directory. And when I want to run this up, I want it to run as an unprivileged user, because I'm going to start this up as root, because I need port 80. Okay? That then gives me an Apache CTL script, just like you'd have with normal Apache, but it's for this particular instance that I'm going to run up. And I've got start, stop, and restart. So I can then configure that into my system init scripts, systemd, your normal initd or whatever. You can configure that in. And so very easily, I've now got this running in production as well. Okay? Now, we had a talk about this morning from Instagram and all the travails and troubles they were going through and getting into their production system. Like, they are an internet scale company. They're huge, right? Most of that information, probably to the people here, is going to be totally irrelevant. The thing that's probably going to be more relevant to people here going forward is containerization. That is the other big thing that's coming up at the moment in Mindshare. So how could we use all this inside of a container, so in Docker? So this is a description of a Docker file. It's a set of instructions to create a Docker image, which then I can run up in a container. So I'm just taking standard Python image off Docker Hub here. I can install Apache. I do some fiddling around with locales because the Python image on Docker Hub is actually a bit broken. I can pip install ModWSGI because they provide pip in the base image, copy my source code into the image, and I just run ModWSGI Express. Nice and simple. Right? I see a lot of people out there building Docker files up and going to all this horrible trouble of setting up Apache configs manually or Nginx configs manually, trying to put in supervisor daemon because they want to run Nginx and uWSGI, and it just becomes a huge mess. This makes it all nice and simple. And you've got Apache in there still. Apache can handle static files. Your WSGI application will handle all the dynamic stuff. All nice and simple. So I got the Docker file, very simple. I build it and I run it. As simple as it gets. But friends don't let friends run containers as root. It's a really, really bad thing that has happened and occurred over time. There's all these images up on Docker Hub. Unfortunately, they sort of tend to all have you running things as root. Now, you may think that running things in containers in root is fine because containers give you a nice boundary, right? But if there's ever a security vulnerability in the container runtime, you're going to be root outside. So you should never run things in root. So that Docker file, as written, is not actually a good idea for that reason. Friends don't let friends use Python without a Python virtual environment. You wouldn't do it on your own box, I hope. Now, you might think that in a container, okay, fine, I'm the only thing in that container, it's all well and good, and I can avoid using a virtual environment. The problem is if you're relying on the Python version from the operating system in the base image, they could have also installed a whole bunch of other packages. In CentOS, they install a version of Flask and a whole bunch of other things to support the operating system. Those package versions will conflict with things you want to install. So you always still want to use a virtual environment inside of a container. So what's a better container image look like? So again, I install Apache up the top. Let's see if I can get my nice little pointer working. Install Apache up the top. I don't want to run as root. So I'm going to add a user. And I'm going to use the user ID, and I'm going to put it in group root. I still fix up my locale stuff because of the broken base image. And down the bottom, I'm going to set a home directory because otherwise you wouldn't normally get one. And I'm going to set a path to where I'm going to install things. The reason I'm going to set a path is I'm going to install that. I'm going to create that virtual environment. That bin directory is the virtual environment bin directory. Now, I'm also going to do something here, up here. I'm going to install a package called warp drive. Okay, this is another one of my packages. Who here has used Heroku? A fair number. You are familiar with build packs, right? Okay. You can imagine warp drive as being a version of a build pack, but specifically set up to help you build up an application to run inside of a container. So I copy my files in. Now, rather than actually defining how to run ModWSGI Express, I'm actually going to get warp drive to do this command at the end, warp drive start. And before that, I've done a warp drive build. My warp drive build is going to look at the source code. It's going to see a requirements.txt file. It's going to install all of the packages I need for me, just like a build pack would do. Warp drive start, it looks at your source code, makes decisions about how your app is structured, and if you said in the requirements.txt you want ModWSGI, it'll start up ModWSGI for you. If you put Gunicorn in there and you've got a WSGI.py file or even Django app, it'll run Gunicorn for you instead. It'll run you WSGI if you said that. So it's not actually ModWSGI specific. And more importantly in all this is when I run it, I can run it as non-root. And there's a bit of magic going in there as well, what warp drive is doing. I can run it as an assigned user ID as well, and it'll all work. So, which is very important when we talk about deploying to a platform, containerized platform, because they don't only want you not to run as root, they will often tell you to run as a certain user ID. Because they could be a multi-tenant system, and you don't want everyone to be running to the same user ID, because if you can break out of the container as a user ID and everyone else is using the same user ID, well, you might be able to get into someone else's container. Okay? Great for containers, but I can also go onto my Mac. I can go pip install warp drive. I can go warp drive project my app. It will go and create me a virtual environment. I can go warp drive build on my Mac, and it will install everything for me in that virtual environment. And I can go warp drive start there. So this tool is not just for containers. You can use it in your development on your own on your own box as well. This means then that you get same tools used for development and what you're going to use in production. So you get that ensuring that things are going to work properly when you move from development to production. I can, from warp drive, get it to create the Docker image for me. I showed you a Docker file before. You don't need to do that. Warp drive will worry about that all for you. Now, to do that, it's actually using under the covers a thing called source to image. Now, I mentioned build packs before. Source to image is like build packs on steroids for containers and creating Docker images. Whereas before you had build packs and they were hard to use them really outside of Heroku, source to image is a way of actually defining up or packaging a way of building up an application, running it inside of a Docker image itself. So a Docker image is the builder. Source to image is going to run up that builder image. It's going to inject your source code in it and then run a command in that running container to build up your application code. And from that, it's going to create a Docker image, which then you can run. So I can run that. In this case, my image builder happens to be this get warped warp0 db8 Python 3.5. So it's going to build an image up for me. But warp drive is just doing that. Now, source to image is also known about by other hosting systems. So in particular, OpenShift knows about it. So if I got my app running, I can use it with source to image or with warp drive. I can very easily then get that up running on a OpenShift, which is using Kubernetes underneath to drive and manage running a Docker image up inside of a container. And OpenShift has a nice GUI. I didn't even need to use the command line here. I could have just gone to the GUI, say Python, put in my URL for my app on my Git repo, here's my name of the app, and it'll go and deploy it for me. So you're starting to use the same sort of tooling all the way through from development through to production and ensuring everything's going to work the same. What if you still needed to do manual configuration? Pip install ModWSGI built up a module, but how do I get that into my normal Apache? So ModWSGI Express, I can run module config command. It will dump out some lines that you can then put in your Apache config to have load that one you just built into your Apache. But Friends don't let friends use embedded mode of ModWSGI. And this is what I mentioned before about you inherit defaults which aren't necessarily the best defaults. When I use ModWSGI Express, it's using all the good defaults. It's using a thing called daemon mode. So it's not actually running your web app inside of the Apache processes. It's created a separate daemon process which it communicates to. When you use Apache yourself manually, it's going to use what's called embedded mode. You shouldn't use that. If you are doing that, don't, please. Friends that let friends use Windows for running Python web apps. So don't use embedded mode unless you're on Windows, because Windows doesn't have a proper concept of forking processes. So it only supports embedded mode. So if you are using ModWSGI and doing manual Apache configuration, if you do not have WSGI daemon process in your file, you should go look up what it's about. But very quickly, top line, restrict embedded on, turn off embedded mode. That way it ensures that if you do muck up the rest of the configuration, it'll at least give you an error if you didn't actually tell it to run your app in the daemon process properly. WSGI script alias, process group is that process group that we created with daemon process, and we set application group equals a global as another trick, which just makes things work a bit better for some Python packages. So if you're not using daemon mode, go look at it. Now, daemon mode though, ModWSGI Express sets all of these nice settings. A lot of those settings are not set for you in daemon mode. Now, I got a lot of options here which, and these default values here is what ModWSGI Express uses. But a lot of those aren't even set in Apache if you do it manually. I'm going to quickly breeze through some of these. There's a lot of content in these. It's mainly for people so you can come back to the slides and look at it as a checklist. So you can go through and go, oh, am I doing this? Oh, what is it? Okay, what did Graham say about this? I should go look at it and perhaps look at using it. Okay? So information overload, a little bit here, but we'll push through. Display name. This is just a convenience one. If you run all your stuff up inside of Apache with ModWSGI and you go PS or look at top, you'll just see a whole bunch of HTTP processes. You can use display name option to give it a nice name. If you set it to group as a magic one, the process name will show as WSGI and the name of that group. It just means you can very easily see it in PS and HTOP output. Language locales. When you deploy stuff under Apache, you tend to inherit ASCII or C locale, which when you try and do stuff with Unicode and if you're not explicitly telling the encoding you want to use, it ends up using ASCII and your program blows up. Very important to set locale and lang options inside of daemon mode to be UTF-8 so that things work nicely if you have forgotten to do those things. Now this is where we start to get interesting. When you deploy an app, you want it to be robust. If your application gets stuck in some way, you want it to recover automatically. You don't want to get a page at 3 a.m. in the morning and saying your app has stopped taking requests and have to wake up and go, oh, I'm going to manually restart it because I have no idea what's going on. A lot of the time when people are running WSGI servers, there is no fail-safes in there to try and recover from a problem. And there's a whole bunch of options in ModWSGI to help you with this, but unfortunately a lot of them are not set. Because again, I couldn't put defaults on them because people were used to it all working in a certain way. So these are all related to daemon mode. So just to clarify what daemon mode is. Apache, you create a parent process. It creates a whole lot of child process which handle the HTTP requests coming in. Daemon mode has another process which your WSGI app's running in. So request comes into the child worker process. It then will proxy it across to the daemon process. So these options, when I talk about connect timeout, that is from child worker process connecting to the daemon process. Now this one does have a timeout. It just simply means that if the WSGI daemon process is overloaded and I can't connect by 15 seconds, it'll fail it. It'll error, the message will get a failure. Socket timeout. Apache has this concept of socket timeouts. It just means that if I try and read or write something on a socket connection anywhere in Apache, if it blocks for more than a certain amount of time, you get an error. The default in Apache is 300 seconds. That is 5 minutes. That is a very stupidly big value. Okay? And by default, it inherits that. Socket timeout, set it to 60. Please drop it down. Queue timeout. Now, queue timeout is a very, very interesting one. If your application does get stuck or it's taking a long time to do something because of a back-end service is having problems, so you're talking to a database, and you've only got a certain number of threads in your application to handle requests. If all your threads get used up, then all these requests are going to start blocking up behind you. But they're going to sit there in a socket listener queue. If your application finally starts up again and starts handling new requests, you're going to get all these stale requests come through. And what's the point of handling a request which was from over a minute ago? The user's long gone. Okay? Queue timeout is something you can set on. It's not by default. And it just simply means that if you do get backlogged like that, but it does recover, then it'll go and say, oh, well, actually, that was sitting in a queue for a long time. I'm going to very quickly get rid of it. I'm not even going to bother trying to handle it. Okay? Startup timeout. This one is Django's fault. When you start up a WSGI application or start up ModWSGI, if you have a transient error loading your application the first time, so let's look at Django or blame Django. Django has to do some first-time initialization, and it may need to talk to a database to do that. If the database is not ready, it will fail. ModWSGI does lazy loading of your web app. So it will try and load your WSGI app, but that will fail in that case. Keep pointing at Marcus. And that's great. It'll go, good. Next request, I'll try loading it again. The problem is you've loaded Django under the covers behind. So even if I reload the WSGI app script, Django's loaded, it's preserved state. And Django has this thing now that where you can't call initialization more than once. And you get this horrible error about it's not re-entrant. And the problem is the process can't do it anymore. It's going to keep erroring. So startup timeout is a way of saying, if I get a transient error on startup, if I still can't load that WSGI script within 15 seconds by the defined timeout, it'll just restart the whole process. And it'll start it, throw it all away, all the cached knowledge, and start over. Request timeout. If a request takes too long, what do? Most WSGI servers will just keep handling the request. And it'll use up that thread or process. And it can't handle anything else. And that's it. You get overloaded. You get more requests in. You get more requests doing that. Eventually, your whole process blocks up. Turn on request timeouts. And what will happen is that if a request takes more than a certain amount of time, that process will get kicked out, restarted. Inactivity timeout. That used to be an old way of doing things. I'll breeze over that one. You can read about that one later. Restart interval. If you have a WSGI application which is taking too much memory, and you want to periodically restart it because it just keeps growing and growing because you've got some funny resource leak, you can define a restart interval. There used to be also one called maximum requests. I'd suggest restart of interval now. Maximum requests has a problem that if you say, I want to restart every 500 requests, that is the worst thing to do if your application is under load. Okay? Because when you're under load, you're getting requests like this. And the more frequently you restart, it's actually going to make things worse, because you're going to slow things down. So use restart interval is a better way. Shutdown time and deadlock timeout. These are just timeouts which help you to kick out the process if when shutting down a process that actually is hanging. So Graceful timeout. This is just if you are restarting processes. Now, it's a bit funny. Apache itself has the means of gracefully restarting the whole of Apache. Unfortunately, the way that Apache manages the daemon process, it doesn't apply to that. So there is no technically graceful way of doing a restart with ModWSGI. What this one is that if you did want to try and do that, you can set up a graceful timeout and you could signal the daemon processes yourself. And that way you'll get a graceful timeout, graceful restart. But if you try and do Apache graceful restart, you won't actually get that. Very quickly, last few things. ModWSGI also has all these things in there for monitoring. There's a way of subscribing to events for getting information about individual requests. So if you are trying to hook up to something like Datadog, ModWSGI does all this hard work for you when they're ready for timing requests, getting how much CPU time was used for an individual request. And you can graph all of that. You can pull out metrics about process usage. And this one's got some key ones in there that help you work out how much of the capacity of your process is being used, and whether you're overloaded, and whether you need to create more processes and threads, or whether you're actually created too many processes and threads and you're not actually using it. And there's also server metrics you can pull out about the whole of Apache as well. So resources, we can come back to the slides. Up on slide share. Now, friends, don't let friends use the ModWhiskey, which comes with a package or the operating system. My last final warning. ModWhiskey that comes with Debian or Ubuntu especially tend to be a few years old. Do not use them. Please use pip install ModWhiskey now. Do not use the ones that provide the operating system. So friends don't let friends use other Whiskey servers, of course, now. Okay? And also, friends don't let friends make things too complicated. Simple is good. Here, great. Not everyone here is going to be a Facebook or a Google or an Instagram or an Eventbrite. Please keep things simple. Don't make your things overcomplicated. And the direction I'm taking ModWhiskey is to try and help you with that. Make things simple. Take away some of that burden of the complexity from you. And that is it. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. We got a coffee mug for you.
I'll do a Tennessee.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for this session. Next one is in 10 minutes by Mike Leonard on the wizardry of metaprogramming.